You have done everything right. I mean, you have read the books, understood the principles, done the visualizations, the affirmations, the practices. And the financial situation is roughly the same as it was a year ago. So the obvious question is, why? Not whether the law works, not whether this is real. The question is why it is not working in your specific life, right now. The answer is not what you think it is. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That is what this is about. Here is what most people do when they discover these teachings. Learn the principle, feel the shift, start the practice. For the first few days, something feels different. An energy, an excitement, a quiet sense that things are about to change. Then, life continues as before. The bank account stays the same. The opportunities do not materialize. The circumstances do not rearrange themselves. So the search begins. Maybe the technique was not quite right. Maybe more specific visualization is needed. Maybe the affirmations need rewording. Maybe there is another teaching, a deeper layer, a missing piece somewhere. More videos, different methods, scripting, revision, the state akin to sleep, inner conversations. Each one feels like it might be the thing. Nothing changes. And here is what makes this particularly painful. The understanding is genuine. This is not someone who skimmed the material. The principle is understood clearly. The mechanism makes sense. The evidence that it works for other people is visible everywhere. The only mystery is why it is not working here, in this life, for this person. That gap between understanding and experiencing is where most people get stuck indefinitely. Neville Goddard identified why with complete precision. Not a technique problem, a consciousness problem. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else he ever taught. The techniques are not failing. The law is not failing. What is failing is the state from which the techniques are being applied. Changing the technique while the state remains the same is like rearranging furniture in a house that is on fire. The problem is not the furniture. There is a line in Feeling is the Secret that explains everything. Neville wrote, "Your subconscious impressions determine the conditions of your world. Not your techniques, not your visualization, not the quality of your affirmations. Your impressions. The felt sense of reality that the subconscious is receiving all day, in every unguarded moment. That is what determines conditions. And most people have never stopped to honestly examine what those impressions actually are." So what is the impression actually being sent to the subconscious? Neville called it the assumption of self. Not what is assumed about money or opportunity or the law. What is assumed about yourself? The deep, largely unconscious sense of who you are in relation to what you want. Most people who study this teaching believe the self-concept has changed. The inner conversations have been revised. The affirmations are there every morning, worthy, abundant, the kind of person wealth flows to naturally. But there is a critical difference between telling yourself something and actually assuming it. And Neville was precise about this difference. He wrote in Feeling is the Secret, "Feeling is the one and only medium through which ideas are conveyed to the subconscious. Not the words, not the intention behind the words, the feeling, the actual felt sense in the body." And then he added something that cuts even deeper. Neville wrote, "The dominant of two feelings is the one expressed." And then, in the same passage, "What you feel you are always dominates what you feel you would like to be." Read that again slowly. What you feel you are always dominates what you feel you would like to be. This is the mechanism most people miss entirely. During a practice session, a feeling of abundance gets generated. It is real, it is genuine, it lasts for 10 or 15 minutes, and then the session ends and the ordinary day resumes. And in the ordinary day, What is the dominant feeling? Not the one generated during practice, the one that is just there, in the background, underneath everything. The feeling when checking the account balance at the supermarket. The feeling when someone asks how things are going. The feeling at 3 in the morning when the mind goes where it goes, unguarded. That ambient feeling, the one that runs constantly underneath the conscious effort, is the dominant impression. And the dominant impression is the one the subconscious receives, the one it faithfully produces in the outer world. Neville also wrote in No One to Change But Self, "If you and I could feel what it would be like were we now that which we want to be, and live in this mental atmosphere as though it were real, then, in a way we do not know, our assumption would harden into fact." Live in this mental atmosphere. Not visit it, not generate it for a session. Live in it as the dominant felt reality of the day. For most people stuck in the loop, that mental atmosphere between the practices is still the old one, the one that was there before any of this. The quiet background assumption that says, this might work for others, but probably not for me. Not really. Not consistently. That is hope. And hope is not assumption. Hope is the language of someone standing outside of what they want, looking at it from a distance, uncertain whether the door will actually open. So how do you actually change the dominant feeling? Not the one during the practice, the one between practices, the ambient one. 4 steps. Step 1. Identify the ambient feeling, not the intended one. For the next 24 hours, pay attention to what is there when nothing is being consciously directed. Not during the practice, in traffic, making food, in the first few minutes of the morning before the day has been decided, in the idle moments when the mind is not occupied with a task. What is the background feeling about money in those moments? Not the feeling that gets generated during practice, the one that is just there, the constant hum running underneath everything. For most people who are stuck, that hum is mild but persistent tension, a low-level anxiety about money that has been there so long it barely even registers as anxiety anymore. It just feels like normal. That is the actual impression the subconscious is working from, hour after hour, day after day. Step 2. Find a specific scene where the feeling was genuinely different. Not a future scene, a real specific moment from memory or imagination where financial ease was just present in the body. Not performed, not generated through effort, just naturally there. A moment from the past when money was not the concern. A particular afternoon, a vacation, a period of life when the chest was simply not tight about any of it. Or, if no such memory comes clearly, an imagined scene. 5 minutes having coffee somewhere quiet, with no financial tension in the background. Nothing dramatic, just the felt absence of the hum. Find that scene. Feel it as specifically as possible, not the image of it, the feeling of it. Step 3. Use that scene as an anchor, not a goal. Neville wrote in Feeling is the Secret. The feeling which comes in response to the question, how would I feel were my wish realized, is the feeling which should monopolize and immobilize your attention as you relax into sleep. Not what the outcome looks like, how it would feel were it already realized. That subtle difference is everything. Most visualizations aim at the destination. This aims at the felt experience of someone already there. Not excitement about arriving, the quiet settledness of someone for whom it is simply done. Practice returning to that feeling, not only in the formal session before sleep, in the ordinary moments. When the ambient tension reappears during the day, return to the anchor briefly, gently, without making a production of it. Step 4. Change the last impression before sleep. Neville was specific and firm about this. Never go to sleep feeling discouraged or dissatisfied. Never sleep in the consciousness of failure. Never. Not most nights. Never. The last impression before sleep is the most direct access point to the subconscious. Whatever feeling accompanies the crossing into sleep becomes the seed planted for that night. Not the visualization from earlier in the day, the actual feeling at the moment of crossing. Find the anchor, the quiet, the settled quality of someone for whom it is already done. Hold it as sleep takes you, not forcing anything, just returning to what is already known. Napoleon Hill opens Think and Grow Rich with a story of Edwin C. Barnes. Barnes arrived at Thomas Edison's laboratory in Orange, New Jersey, with no money, no connections, no credentials. Had ridden a freight train to get there. Hill writes that walking in, he looked like a tramp. But Edison gave him a minor role at a very small wage. Barnes took it. 5 years passed. No visible sign of progress. No indication the thing he had come for was any closer. And then Barnes got his partnership, became the primary distributor of Edison's dictating machine. Hill's point is about burning desire and persistence, but read the story again through what Neville was teaching at exactly the same time. Barnes did not arrive hoping to become Edison's partner. He arrived already assuming it, walked into that office from the internal state of someone who already belonged there, not performing confidence, actually occupying a different felt reality inside himself. And for 5 years, through every day of menial work, through no visible progress, that internal state held. The ambient feeling underneath all of it was not hope. It was the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided. That is what the subconscious was receiving all day as its dominant impression. That is the gap between what Barnes was doing and what most people struggling with this are doing. The practice may be the same, the understanding may be the same. The gap is in what is happening in the ordinary hours between the practices, in what the subconscious is receiving as the dominant impression while life is just being lived. Neville described the subconscious as something that simply cannot change the impressions it receives. It only expresses them. He wrote in Feeling is the Secret, "The subconscious never alters the accepted beliefs of man. It outpictures them to the last detail. It does not evaluate whether an impression is desirable or not. It does not filter for what is wanted versus what is feared. It receives the dominant felt sense and produces it in the outer world with what Neville called mathematical precision." Barnes held the right dominant impression for 5 years, not through formal techniques, as his actual lived internal state in the ordinary moments of ordinary working days. That is why it worked. Not the desire, not the persistence, the quality of the dominant ambient feeling during the 5 years in between. 3 patterns keep people in the loop. The third one is the one nobody talks about. Mistake 1. Measuring the state by the outcome. Most people check whether the practice is working by looking at whether anything has changed externally. If the money has not moved, the practice is not working. So the technique gets adjusted or replaced entirely. But this is exactly backwards. The outer reality is always a reflection of past impressions, not current ones. Neville compared it to a shadow following an object. When position changes, the shadow does not move simultaneously. There is always a delay. Measuring the internal state by external results is measuring the shadow to determine the position of the object. It will always be behind, and adjusting the practice based on that reading keeps everything permanently chasing something that is already in the process of changing. The only measurement that matters is the ambient feeling between practices. Mistake 2. Doing the practice and living the contradiction. Neville wrote in Feeling is the Secret. Be careful of your moods and feelings, for there is an unbroken connection between your feelings and your visible world. Unbroken. Not interrupted during practice sessions and then restored afterward. Unbroken, continuously, all day. The language used when talking about money, the way the situation gets described to other people, the feeling in the body when a bill arrives, the comparison that quietly stirs when someone else is doing well. Each of those moments is also sending an impression to the subconscious. The subconscious does not distinguish between a formal visualization and a casual conversation loaded with the feeling of lack. Both are impressions. Both are received and acted upon. The formal practice cannot overcome the cumulative weight of everything happening between practices if that everything is still the old state. Mistake 3. Trying to believe instead of practicing the return. This is the subtlest mistake and the most common one at this level of understanding. Belief is a conclusion. Feeling is a practice. Belief cannot be decided into existence through effort or force of will. Most people approach this as a belief problem. Need to believe more strongly, need to have more faith. And so they try to generate belief, to convince themselves more deeply, which never works because belief is a result, not a method. It cannot be manufactured directly. What can be practiced is the return. Finding the anchor feeling, losing it when the ordinary day pulls attention elsewhere, and returning to it, again and again. Not perfectly, consistently. The subconscious does not require perfect, unbroken belief held all day without interruption. What shifts the dominant impression over time is the consistent return, even imperfect, to the anchor feeling. Each return is a deposit. Over enough time, the deposits accumulate and the dominant impression shifts. This shift, when it actually happens, always comes from the same place. Not a new technique, not a breakthrough realization about the law, a change in what is happening in the space between the techniques. In my corporate years, someone I worked alongside had been studying these ideas seriously for almost 2 years. Disciplined, consistent, doing everything correctly. But the results were not moving. When we talked about it once, what came out was this. The practice was being treated as completely separate from the rest of the day. Sessions happened morning and evening, and between them was just normal life, which meant all the normal background anxiety about money running quietly underneath everything. One change was made. Instead of treating the morning and evening sessions as the practice, the ordinary moments became the practice. Every time the ambient tension about money appeared during the day, no fighting it, no countering it with affirmations. Just a brief, quiet return to the anchor feeling. The specific sensation of one memory where the tension had been absent. Within a few months, something came through that had no logical explanation. A contact not spoken to in years reached out with something that matched exactly what had been internally occupied. The word afterward, the practice did not change. What changed was the space between the practices. That is always where the shift happens, not in the technique, in the unguarded hours. Here is the real reason the financial situation has not changed. Not because the law does not work, not because the technique is wrong, because the dominant impression the subconscious is receiving between practices is still the old one. Still the background hum of someone who does not yet have it. Still hope, not assumption. No formal practice overrides that dominant impression. The subconscious does not average out the hour of practice against the other 23. The dominant feeling wins. Always. But the dominant feeling can change. It changes the same way it formed in the first place, through repetition, through what gets returned to, again and again, in the ordinary, unguarded moments of the day. Neville said it plainly. An assumption, though false, if sustained, will harden into fact. Sustained, not visited, sustained. Tonight, before sleep, do not try to generate the feeling of wealth. Find the feeling of the absence of the tension, the quiet, the settled quality of someone for whom it is already done. Hold it as sleep takes you. And tomorrow, when the old hum returns, which it will, return to that quiet, briefly, without drama, again and again. That is the practice, and it costs nothing but attention. If this landed for you, the channel is Wealth Awakened. Every week we go deeper into these teachings, not the simplified version, but the actual mechanism underneath. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. The video on your screen goes deeper into this method.